Welcome to the Great I.O. Get-Together. On tonight's show, quips and queries about the world of work as I.O. psychology comes alive. Now please welcome our hosts, Richard and Tara.
Welcome everyone to Great I.O. Get-Together number 30. My name is Richard, this is my co-host Tara. Today we're exploring chapter 4 of our textbook, Research Methods for I.O. Psych, and this chapter is all about sampling. So to help us understand how to make good sampling decisions, on the show today, we have Dr. Brad Brummel, Professor of Psychology and Director of the I.O. Psych program at the University of Houston. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. Good to see you and Tara again. Happy to be here.
So just to start us out, can you just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, why you might be a sampling genius?
I don't know about sampling genius, but I have, what my friends have called like among the most eclectic CVs they've seen. So I've done work with engineers and journalists, and early in my career, we were making some of the first websites to get people to fill things out. My dissertation study had 10,000 people on it because it was attached to a choose your own adventure dating study that my colleague had made, and people were excited to fill it out sort of in the heydays of the 2007 internet. So I have chased many different samples, and so I know something about trying to get hard samples, I guess. So.
Sure. So you mentioned engineers. Maybe we can start there. What interests you about engineers? Why study them?
Well, there's a lot of simple reasons and then bigger ones. So I come from a family of engineers. So two of my sisters are civil engineers. My dad is an agricultural engineer, so he designs houses for turkeys and cows and blueberries. But probably the shorter answer there is that the NSF cares about the development of engineers more than they care about the development of other people. And so I have had opportunities to do some cool projects with engineers because there was funding. The other thing I think that influenced it was at the University of Tulsa, it was a very small school. And so it was really necessary and easy to work across colleges. And so I had a number of engineers who started with me, and they had ideas about projects that they could work on. And so they're like, hey, let's do this project with ethics or with soft skills training. And they seemed fun. So that really drew me to that area as well.
So does studying engineers help you understand your family? Is that what I should
maybe at least when they ask questions, I can say like, oh, I know something about that, I guess. So I can tell some stories. And then actually a lot of the sort of leadership development coaching work that I've done have been with engineer types. So the challenge of taking someone who's a strong individual contributor in a technical role and then having them move to a manager or leader position requires sort of a big mindset shift. And so that experience with engineers and like sort of the deep respect for what they do helps when we start to say, now you have to do work quite differently. And it's going to be a lot harder to count how effective you are. So
it raises kind of an interesting question. So a lot of I.O. I think focuses on this, like developing general theories of the worker or theories of the manager. Like how much do you customize what you focus on based on these kind of like population issues? Like how unique are engineers really in this problem?
Oh, that's interesting. I think there are cultures where the way in which you perform or get status are quite different at the individual performer level. And then when you move up, you have to do different developmental trajectories. So I've worked with an organization that was almost all women doing social services work, and then an organization that was almost all men, making heaters and designing cell towers. And sort of the things that you need to change in terms of your style when you move up to leadership are quite different. So stereotypically, the engineers actually have to listen to people's stories and not just tell them what to do. And conversely, the social services people have to become a little bit more task oriented and realize that sort of the friendships that they have aren't the way to always just get work done. And so a lot of the times it is a modulation sort of back to what's ever not easy, because you'll tend to do the thing that you're sort of that comes most naturally. And you have to do both sides when it comes to leading, both the task and the person side.
One thing I like about the way that you're framing this, Brad, is that I think we have a lot of people who study identities, like they study gender or race at work, but that's the research question. And what you're saying is that whatever the research question is, you need to be thinking about these dynamics, but it's not the research question itself. It's not like, how does gender work in the workplace, but rather understanding the fact that this is this is an organization predominantly made up of women changes the way that you ask your research questions from there. The reason I think that's really interesting is that it's come up before when we've been talking about the book, the topic of me search and how to balance, like, doing me search is just about yourself and like your own experiences in the world, which is, not necessarily, you don't know everything. And balancing that with using what you know, using your firsthand experience to ask richer and more interesting research questions about the world.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways I think about that is, if you're studying why you tick the way you tick, right? Maybe that should be better done with your coach or therapist or friends. But if you're saying, I have unique insight into an area or access because of the life I lived, then you're likely to ask deeper, more interesting questions. And so I think it is more, for me, this me search that is problematic when you're trying to justify you as somebody who matters, who's right, who has status, or figure yourself out. But the experiences you have that give you unique insights into the nuance of a position, that give you deep respect for what people are doing, those are advantages. And so I think that's one of the lines where people run into. And even in the class discussion about that part of the book, people are like, well, like, am I not supposed to study anything? Am I supposed to be totally objective, like separated? We could swap each other out. I'm like, no, that's not the point, right? Because if you're not curious about something, I don't think you'll do good research either. So I kind of say, like, follow your curiosity, but don't just like turn the entire world into a projection. So
You've taken us on kind of an interesting journey here. I will admit to have been a little nervous when you just started with, well, NSF gives me money for this, so that's what I do. But it sounds like it's a much more complex problem for you, and that's a pretty big simplification over how you really approach it.
yeah, well, the difference that I had coming out of graduate school is my engineer friends, when they hear a question, they say, we could get money for that. And so my questions didn't start with, let's go get money. They started with, so we had an engineer who did car crash reconstruction, a lawyer who did expert evidence testimony class, and then I came in talking about role plays. And they were like, I bet it would be more meaningful to teach engineering ethics if they reconstructed a car crash and then took that reconstruction and applied to work with an unethical lawyer who was trying to get them to change the results. And then we're like, oh, that's going to be sweet. And then the NSF agreed. And so it wasn't chasing money. It was like, oh, we have an idea that we think actually would be appealing. And so in the cases that I've done it, it wasn't about the money. It was that, oh, the question seemed like it related. And then sort of the engineers that I worked with who really have more of that payoff structure, we're like, I bet that's just something the NSF would care about. So I think it wasn't really money first for me ever. Probably I'm not even strategic enough on that front. But it has enabled us to do some interesting things. So.
Well, I mean, it seems like in many cases, what you can get money for is a shortcut or a proxy for what's in the national interest or what's like a priority to someone other than you, it's helpful, I think, to start thinking about, like, is this question important? Like, important to who?
To whom? Yeah, no, and I think in that case, it's really been the case where a lot of the work that I've done in the engineering space, some of it's been grant funded. Almost none of it's had any chance of being published in an A-tier IO journal, because it was about interventions. It was about developing educational things. We might have 30 people go through it in a year, hugely labor intensive. It wouldn't be strategic work from a academic career perspective, but we thought the questions were interesting enough to build on. So I think that's another piece too, where almost no one's going to give you money to do the work that's in your head, but they will have opportunities if you can align with a question that's of interest to the nation, to a specific group of people. So
it's kind of a little bit to the side of sampling, but it seems like this has led to a successful academic career. I mean, you've made it, right? Like, this is the job everybody wants. So
yeah, I mean, there's
worked out.
They're stuck with me. Well, so this was a different thing, and it might be a little bit off the side, but when I went to the University of Tulsa, so I was at the University of Tulsa for 15 years, and they kind of said, you don't have to do anything, but you have to do something. And from the very beginning, they just said, we're cool with you doing interdisciplinary research. You can work with the clinical people that we had there or the engineers or whoever, but you need to be doing something. So the beauty of an R2 school at the time was that they were like, you need to be doing something, but you can make a case that what you're doing is important and interesting. And so it really was much less stressful, I think, to start at a school that didn't quite have the expectations of some bigger ones. And I've kind of found myself at a place that's a little bit, it's R1 in how it is, but I think some of the same ideas still apply. The University of Houston does appreciate interdisciplinary research, and we work pretty collaboratively, which is, again, one of the reasons why I took the job.
To get back to sampling a little bit, we talked a lot about engineers. That I don't know if that's a uniquely available population to you versus like other grad students thinking about their own set of sampling problems. Are there populations that you would point people toward, like that you think are understudied in IO, or even more broadly than that, kind of this interdisciplinary like space? What's important?
Yeah, I think that currently my former graduate student and I are really interested, again, in job applicants. We miss job applicants because they're in the applicant pool and then they leave at some point or another, and they're really hard to get because why would they keep working with or talking about what happened after they were removed from the pool if they even heard it? And so I think a big issue we have is that we've outsourced almost all of the attraction part of applications to these internet HR systems that don't treat people with any respect or even like people until they've been in the system for maybe 6 months. And then people are upset when someone ghosts them on an interview after they gave them no respect on their way into the program. Take all these tests and we'll decide if you're good enough for us to even talk to. And so we don't know much about what that's doing to people other than some stories about how depressing it is to be in the market, getting nothing back, throwing things out into the nethers. And so, that's an area where I think that we're missing out on understanding exactly what all this technology is doing to the relationship between someone and an employer. And I really believe that a lot of people are leaving with some possibly high level of disdain for employers without ever actually interacting with anyone who works there, because they force you to go through this gateway that's so impersonal without any knowledge of what's happening in the process. And so for me, that's a current strong fascination. Like, what are we doing to people there? Sure. And then my second biggest sort of sample of people that I've always wanted to get a hold of, and this comes all the way back from my first years in graduate school, are the actual sexual harassers. So we study the victims, but we don't get to study the people who are actually the perpetrators very often. It's like, what were you thinking, right? Like, what led you to think that behaving this way was in any way going to lead to, I don't know what outcome, right? So we just tend to assume that they're like jerks or something, but there's got to be a story in people's heads there. And so that's another hard to reach sample that I think is important to understand as we try to solve some of these things for a more equal workforce. So anyway, job applicants who then disappear into the next thing. And, the people who are sexually harassing people are my two sort of white whales of sample.
Yeah, those are pretty different. As a kind of a thought experiment, then, if a grad student came to you and wanted to study one of those groups, I will let you pick which. What would you recommend that they do? Like, how would you reach those populations realistically?
The way I've done it is I've just started to talking to people with access in these spaces. So when we want to do something, we go to the populations and start having discussions. So we wrote a paper on police officer selection, and we just started talking to police departments. And 2 of 15 said, yeah, we can give you some data in a certain way. So someone contacted me actually earlier this year who I went email back to about doing a little more testing as part of job boards. So if you have somebody who runs a job board, then all of a sudden they have the stories of people who are going through these interviews and in these spaces. And you can say, hey, like, can we talk? What are you doing? Are there avenues in? And what I really say is, if you're trying to be an expert, maybe you get the reputation for being an expert if you publish a meta-analysis or get something done. But a lot of the things we do won't pay off in terms of publications, but each thing you do develops expertise. So you go where the samples are and you just start asking people questions because you're curious. And maybe what you end up doing will look a little different, but that curiosity actually builds expertise that then leads to different questions. And so I really try to push my students to do a lot of interviews, place themselves in the area, and that sort of gives them, whether they do a multi-method study or they do a qualitative piece, talk to a lot of people who are on the front lines of whatever you're doing. And sometimes that leads to a sample that you would have never gotten if you didn't show up, or if you showed up and said, I would like you to give me a sample, which again, isn't really how social exchange works, right? That's you just trying to get something for free. So yeah, most of the samples I've gotten access to have come from just talking to people and sort of seeing, what opportunities show up, what aligns for both parties.
Do you think that our field would look different if more people spent more time just talking to workers and like spending time watching workers at work?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think, one of the best things that happened to me was actually having sort of a few real jobs. Actually, I have a really, big sort of origin story where I was fired from my first job for insubordination. And that job was at Subway. So they had a big week. They got a bonus back. The owner put a sign on the wall, but didn't give the employees anything. And so on the whiteboard in the back, I told the owner what he could do with that award. Which got me fired. But the next time they had a bonus for a good week, everyone got a bonus. So like I evoked positive change, and I've kind of been insubordinate and cared about workers for the rest of my life. So, but I think those things happen. I think some of our ideas are kind of they're not as deep in resonance, right? When you think about counterproductive work behaviors, it's like stealing or time theft or kind of these white collar things. But like, they don't talk about, doing construction and having someone drop a dead cat on your head, like while you're working because he was petting it and then realized it had been dead for a while. And he was like, what do I do with this thing? I have to share the joy, right? And so like, those are the things that happen in real workplaces. And if all we do is stare at data, we're not really unpacking some of those things. So.
Is that a story I should know of a dead cat?
No, that just happened to it was a personal story. That happened to me when I was doing construction. So that was a personal story.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So maybe turning back to the kind of practical advice side of this.
Yeah.
So you teach methods. Thank you for your service to our book. What I would ask next, though, is in your experience in that methods course, with or without the book, what is it that you think students or have noticed students struggle with most? How do you approach this?
Yeah, I think they struggle the most with trying to do methods right. They're like, I'm going to do this right method. And, the point, which I think you did a really nice job of with the book, is this point we try to make where like, you can't do it right or perfectly, but you can definitely do it wrong. And each of those choices is a decision that you need to make. And I was kind of, teasing them a little bit, but I'm like, every single one of these decisions is absolutely fair game for your committee to ask you about on your thesis or dissertation. And the answer isn't just someone said I should do it, and so that piece is really tough to let them know, like, that each choice has implications, but it's not necessarily right or wrong. And, I think your book was a really nice invitation to think that way. And one of my, dreams for the field, or one of the things I've really been encouraging people to do, is like change the name of their limitations section from limitations to limitations to generalizability. So you say, hey, I wrote this paper. Here's some things I wouldn't say from what I did. So you're actively saying, as someone who went through it, I don't think you can say this. I don't think you can say this. And here's some things maybe you can say. And that's a lot less defensive, and it's a lot more sort of realistic when it comes to what you're doing. So I think that piece all ties together. It's just a number of choices you've made, hopefully informed choices. And hopefully, if you didn't know that much about it yet, it's something you just asked some other experts about. So I really try to get them to talk to people about the pros and cons of every choice. And I think in some of the other methods books, they don't give you any invitation to ask those questions with curiosity, naively, why do that? And so I think that's really the struggle. The worry about doing it perfectly removes this curiosity about why this or why that.
Yeah, I really like that framing. I especially like the sort of threats to generalizability, because I often feel that in certain contexts, in study design, I will purposefully sacrifice something in exchange for something else, right? And then you always fight this struggle when writing a paper of how do I say this in a way that a reviewer appreciates that and doesn't immediately discount the study because they have some rule encoded in their head for how things work. Actually, kind of along those themes, how does this subtlety translate into your work, perhaps as a reviewer, and how you understand the research you read? Do you expect very tightly well-defined samples? What kind of write-ups are you looking for? How do you approach that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not a very common reviewer. So I've been on a path for a while where I was spending half my review on how the practical implications weren't relevant from what they said. So people will give good advice in their practical implications that have nothing to do with the study they did, right? They're this mediated moderator, huge model, and they're like, I think bosses should be nice to their employees and hire conscientious people. And I'm like, that's cool, but it had nothing to do with the research you did. We either knew it before or it's generic advice. But I do find myself really curious about how people got samples. So one thing that really turns me off as a reviewer, if people pretend that they collected the sample to answer the research question when it's really clear that they asked the question because they had the sample. And so it's no, you didn't do that. And sometimes I'll write it that way when they're using historical nationwide sort of sample. It's well, we know what the sample is. You didn't collect this sample for this, and it even says in here. So why are you kind of writing it as if? And so that's a piece that gets to me. And then the last paper I reviewed, they were trying to make conclusions about the way leaders in companies make decisions about pay. Right. So they're how do we do pay equality? What is the system like? And then all of their studies were decision-making allocations, judgment decision-making, done by MTurk workers, in some cases getting paid 20 cents. And I'm I don't think these decisions have anything to do with what people are actually doing in the real world. This is completely inappropriate for you thinking that you can generalize in this way. I think their studies showed something about people's gender biases and the decisions they would make, but they tried to frame it within these very structured, very thoughtful ways of doing real money allocations. And then to do it, they gave people no money. So
sure.
So that shows up. And I think another thing that I've always cared about, but I've come to care about even more, is we call people in our studies participants for a reason. And because we're supposed to respect them as humans. And I really think that the online panels, a lot of these approaches don't show respect for the people that we're working with. And we all kind of went to graduate school at the same time. I used to have to debrief people after I made them do something. Sure. And it's all gone out the window when we're paying people in these online samples. And I think there's a real big loss there where you don't think about telling the people what they've just been through. So I don't know. I was really proud of a recent study we did. We had this whole debrief where we asked people about what they experienced going through a study, if they liked it. We just asked them all these questions about what it was like to go through, and we got some really nice comments just about oh, this was actually interesting. Oh, I actually felt like I mattered, unlike these other studies I get paid to do. And so if I think that's a big piece of it, right? So if we lose this idea that these are participants in our research, then a lot of downstream questions are answered. in different ways. So it's more expensive, but if you actually respect the people on the other end of whatever, you sample differently.
Well, so would you say that there is a right way to go about mechanical Turk type research then? What would be your recommendations for doing that kind of online panel stuff?
I mean, the first thing I would say is you need to make sure that's a legitimate way to get data for your research question. I mean, that's number one. Number two, you have to decide what you think about pay, right? So if you think about them as workers, what's the least you're able to pay them to have them do something like that? Like, what would you do it for, right? So you're not taking advantage of people. You're really respecting their time. And then I think, I really think we should really clue them in on why they're doing what they're doing. Right? You're not just doing this for $3 or $5 or 30 cents or whatever you got away with. This is the kind of study you were involved in. And here's why. Even to say, hey, if you want to get the study once it's done, I'll email it to you. Like these other ways of actually doing a little bit of the extra work to let people know that they were participants. And so I've never used MTurk for a study. I've used some of the other panels. And there are ways to use them more or less thoughtfully. I have to give my former student Seth Osborne a lot of credit because we were doing some research on some applicant reactions type work, and we wanted a demographically diverse sample. And so one of the things that he figured out how to do in Prolific actually is to not take one study and make it like 4 to get a diverse sample. So in one subsample, he said, we won't take any white people. In one subsample, he said we won't take any heterosexual people. And this actually allowed us to have a full sample that had way more diversity than you have in the population by having certain samples that you selected out the majority group. And so, I think it's, it depends on if you think everyone's the same. So it's really research question dependent.
I would just throw in there, Prolific is amazing now because you can select any demographic you want to target and then set quota percentages associated with them to target and sub-target any specific population you want in a way that's not really possible with like an MTurk.
But they are people who are still making money on a survey platform, often while at work. And so, again, that is a very specific kind of person, though maybe not in the traditional ways we divide people up. So it just has unique affordances and limitations, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's turn to what is your maybe favorite example from your own work in terms of especially kind of sampling and design issues. What are you most proud of?
Yeah, I think I'm most proud of a study. It's my most cited paper. And one of the favorite things I had happen about it, it was once used by a graduate student at another university as an example of bad research, which was like super exciting because what happened is we wrote it so clearly. So all the ways in which we violated the norms of what you would expect in it are just right in there. We didn't have a big enough sample for multi-level modeling, so we just within group normed performance. And so we did all these things that like this first year student was like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And I'm like, man, you should have called me up for that seminar. I would really enjoy it. But what we did is we looked at mindfulness in performance of restaurant workers, and we had their supervisors rate their performance. And so along with my colleague, Eric Dane, who's at WashU in the business school, first we actually went and interviewed a bunch of restaurant workers about what it's like to work in a restaurant. And, what happened sort of in this dynamic environment, what was it like to be in the weeds, and sort of did this part of it. And then we said, okay, servers are the right kind of audience for this kind of thing. And then we were like, oh, how do we get access to restaurant workers and their supervisors who'd be willing to rate them? And basically, a couple of my graduate students just wandered around on weekends and begged them to do it. So they would like show up and they're like, hey, we can show up at 3 when the shift comes over. Like, we'll have these paper surveys for you to fill out. We'll do these things. And they had been in restaurant industries. And so they just went around and begged supervisors to like, let us do it. And so it was just a lot of effort to go around and see who was willing to do it. We ended up with like 7 restaurants. So the sample's way smaller than we would hope for, but we just went around and just sort of asked people to participate in those spaces and then made it really easy for them to do so. But But so I think what was nice about that is we actually looked for a job where the theories could play out. And then we talked to people to make sure that this was right. We had these assumptions. We've all been to restaurants. And then after we had that, we, went around and found people in these spaces who are willing to do this work. So yeah, I think that really aligns with how we're trying to do things. So it wasn't convenient at all, really, to collect that data, especially for my students who are giving up weekends to wander around and then just it was cold call. They'd wander into a restaurant and be like, hey, I'm a student. I'm trying to do this work. Do you think maybe you can get people to fill out these surveys? And some people said yes.
Do you face have you faced the tension of there being a sample that you really want and you think you might be able to get access to it, but not as many people as you want? Like, how do you resolve that? Like, is there a point where you say, you know what, it's not worth it? Or is the drive to, we can really help some people here and really help them out? Is that enough?
Yeah.
How do you navigate it?
That's so tough from advice perspective. Almost all the work I'm doing now is with students and sort of with students' projects. And so the question is like, well, what are we getting out of this? And, one of my favorite studies I was actually on was a clinical student who got 85 transgender and gender non-conforming individuals to fill out the full MMPI 2 and 3 and a whole bunch of other scales. So 3 hours of personality testing. And this student, William Bryant, went around to, I think, 6 or 7 different states, to equality centers, built relationships, and would show up to collect the data from people in person over 2 years. And so he ended up running t-tests to compare it, but the gist of the study allowed people to see that if they just went with the normal cutoffs that you're getting for a normal population, you'd be overdiagnosing this population on a number of disorders because of the unique stress that they were under. And I worry that in our field, if someone just did a similar study that was out there in a unique population, the field would shrug and not think it was good work. Right? The work of actually going to where they are as the hard work of the study, somehow wouldn't be respected as important. And that's a part of the field that I really worry about, because we don't need another theory or another moderator. We probably need some unique samples to see if it holds up in that sample. That's the right way to do boundary conditions a lot of times. And then the study wouldn't, you'd replicate the study exactly, but just with a new population. And, if that's not rewarded, then we're missing out on something important. So that's a long way around of saying I would strongly support a student who wanted to take that approach to what they were doing. And I'm actually okay with students, especially in our field, starting with the population. I have a student right now who wants to do her dissertation on construction workers and specifically issues around alcoholism and suicidality in a population that we know it's high and we think they're going to be unique, because it's highly masculine, they have travel, they have all these different things. And we kind of, our top researchers don't approach work that way that often. So I don't know, it's a long way of kind of unpacking some of those questions, but I really do think sample is the hard work of a project, should be respected a lot more than just a new method, a different theory, another path and a model, the other ways we can contribute.
Sure. Well, maybe to wrap us up then, if you were to give your number one recommendation, your single best piece of advice to the grad student that only remembers one thing from listening to this entire video here about sampling, what would your piece of advice be?
Oh man, it's the one piece of advice. Your sample matters as much or more than your statistics that you run on what you do. So think about who you actually want to generalize your research to, and then go figure out how to make it happen. And I don't have a lot of respect for people, honestly, who are students and say it's too hard to get this sample. Because, when I was in graduate school, I was told that I needed a employee sample for my dissertation because I had an online sample. I had 2 studies just with undergrads, which were pretty easy to get at Illinois. And so I actually, again, in 2007, was wandering around Champaign-Urbana with an envelope of cash, giving people $5 of cash to fill out my surveys, and then $10 if they could get their supervisor to do it too. And so, like, I'd be like going and getting my hair cut, and I'm like, hey, you're an employee. Like, will you fill out a survey for $5? And so I think like that sort of, beat the pavement, go find people who are willing to do things approach, changes how you think about research in all the ways we've talked about. You see the person, you're talking to them, so you have this respect for them. They might not let you walk around with $10 or whatever. You might need to do gift cards or something these days. But I do think there's something to be said for begging someone to be in your study, to kind of have the proper level of humility about what we're doing. Right. And so this neat curated online sample or this already collected organizational data really does separate us psychologically and physically from the workers. So I think, I don't know, tell your advisor that they're wrong when they think something is too hard or interacting with people is a problem. I was just having like sort of a flashback to grad school, and Chuck Heelan one time told us the great thing about IO psychology is he's like, we study constructs, not people. So you don't even have to really like people or even interact with them to do this work. And he always said something with like a wry like smile, and he's like, of course, he's like, that makes you a certain kind of person, and then you go from there. But he'd have these pieces, and I always think about that, right? It's like, do we study people? It's like, no, we kind of study constructs, and this leads to a lot of bad and goofy science where we're talking about constructs instead of people, and then all of a sudden we get to the practical implications. We start talking about people again, and it's like, well, you never study people actually. You only study traits. Grafted away from people, and then you looked at how those things correlated in order to predict an outcome, but you never actually studied the people, not in the way most people would think about it. So,
well, that is a wonderful final piece of advice. Thank you so much for coming by, Brad.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you for writing that great book. It made teaching the class so much more fun, accessible. The students really related to the approach.
That's it for another gig. To stay in touch, subscribe on YouTube, check out our website at thegig.online, join our LinkedIn group, sign up for our email notification list, and join our Discord. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time for another great I.O. get-together.